Well, it's good to be with you all. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really glad to have my wife with me. But before I leave, you'll be glad that my wife is with me too, Kim. We come from Newcastle, Indiana is our home. I grew up in Kentucky, but we have a bunch of West Virginia folks in Newcastle. You all are doing a great job of spreading your influence all over. Kevin and Sarah Yater, I think are known by this church. They're now with us. And Josh and Eliza and their 5 children are now with us. And I think going to be with us for a good while. So we enjoy that. And I don't know if y'all, Bill and Nina Kane and Wayne and Penny Teal and then Wayne and Penny's grandchildren, Phil and Tim Teal, they have West Virginia roots somehow, but they're all in Newcastle. So Newcastle's not the main city in Indiana, I don't know, but we're really appreciative of those good people and, as you can tell, a sizable influence in the church there. So we appreciate that. But first time for Kim and I to be with you all, and we're grateful for the invitation, looking forward to our time together. This series of lessons it came about from listening in to private conversations. What I mean by that is a time when people who are outside of Christ and had been sort of comfortable there, but in the last several years, when almost everything in this world has been turned upside down, it has brought a lot of instability to a lot of people's lives. And the things that people counted on and found some security in, those things have really changed. And so the conversation that I'm talking about is a conversation between someone who's outside of God, but with their whole world turned upside down. They find a private place where nobody's watching, and they get on their knees, and maybe for the first time in all their life, they say, God, I've got some questions. And it is desperate, and it is earnest. And they lay before God the things that have kept them from taking the next step toward Him. But now the circumstances of life brought them to this point. And I am imagining an opportunity to be a fly on the wall and listen to that conversation. And the series of lessons that I'm calling, Okay, God, I've got questions, it comes from doing the very best I can to listen to what's happening around us and what people are saying or feeling or are privately uttering as they try desperately, finally, to talk to God and then listen to God's response. And this series of lessons is never in my life as a preacher have I tried harder, more prayerfully, to develop some lessons with those outside of Christ. I've never tried harder to do that than with this series of lessons. Because while there's a lot of faults with it and faults in the presentation of these lessons, I have never tried harder to really listen to what's going on. And then to talk about these questions so that God can speak to where people are and their desperate need for something that makes sense in a world that increasingly does not make sense. And so, okay, God, I've got questions. And so these 6 lessons that I'm having the opportunity to talk about, that's where they come from. And that's what we're going to do. And I think you all have probably seen the series of lessons that I'm planning. What am I supposed to see in this crazy time? And where is all this going? And what's at the end? And what kind of response am I supposed to make? Is there any hope for all this? And okay, I'll be a Christian, but I don't want the church. Those are the things we're going to be talking about. So you can take these lessons and perfect them and say them in your own way, and I hope you will, because we really have an opportunity to teach a world that the foundations are eroding, and people need something to stand on. They've always needed God, and now it's our job and our opportunity to talk to Him. So you take what I say and make it better, and I'm going to keep trying to say it the very best way I can and wherever I can. So I want to start in Acts chapter 27 and ask you to turn your New Testaments there, and we'll read it together. Acts chapter 27, and I'll start with verse number 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some of the prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an Andromedian ship, which was about to sail to the region along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the wind was contrary. When we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there, if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long, there rushed down from the land a violent wind called Eurykio, and when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day, as they were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing them, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in the midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night the angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. And when the 14th night came, as we were being driven about the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little further they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing that they might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship and had let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Unless the men remain on the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore, I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair of your head of any of you will perish. Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship onto it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind, and they were heading for the beach. But striking the reefs where the two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intention and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest follow on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. Okay, well, thank you for letting me read that passage of Scripture. This chapter is a famous one in some respects outside of the Bible and those who respect it as inspired by God, because it is a rather rare glimpse into what ocean vessels were like and what traveling on the ocean was like way back 2,000 years ago in Bible times. There aren't a lot of records of what that was like, but Acts chapter 27 records in considerable detail what it was like. And so unbelievers have often gone to this passage and found a lot of instruction and helpful information in their research about those days. But, as I was reading it, you could tell there's a lot of names. There are parts of the ship, habits of sailors, what you do when danger comes, how you handle things when you think you're not going to survive at all. How do you undergird an entire ship while fighting a storm at sea? What is this extra boat that they carry along, and when might it be discharged, and when would it be dangerous to keep with? A lot of details given here. Okay, now on a completely side note, if the people were to question whether the Bible is an inspired book or not, here in Acts chapter 27, these 44 verses, one might wonder, okay, why did God provide this kind of information? I mean, this is Luke's second installment of God's salvation story. What Jesus began to do and teach was the Gospel of Luke. What Jesus continued to do and teach is the book of Acts, both written by Luke. And they tell, by inspiration, Luke is the historian and author of the written description of God's salvation story, as he looks to the beginning, the birth of Jesus, and he looks 30 years beyond the establishment of the Lord's church. Here it comes. Here's what's been anticipated. And in the midst of that story, or maybe toward the end of that story, actually, here is Acts chapter 27. An inspired book. And in this inspired book, the writer describes winds and island locations and strategies for navigating the winds. And if someone was trying to put together a book and call it inspired, but really not, why risk your credibility by providing details like this? Just kind of gloss over those details and speak in generalities. That's not what happens here. Great details, geographically, in an oceanographic sort of a way. Details are given with great confidence of accuracy, and we know why. Because these words are from God. They're inspired by God. And Acts chapter 27, if you are interested or have been interested in, how do you defend the Bible and those kinds of studies, Acts chapter 27 is a great place to go. Very interesting. I've included in my notes a quotation that's been really helpful to me over the years. Charles Finney said it a long time ago when he was asked, how do you defend the Bible from its critics, and how do you defend the accuracy and inspiration? How do you defend the Bible? And his answer was, well, you defend it like you do a lion. You just let it out of its cage. And that's really helpful. You just let the Bible show what the Bible says. And Acts chapter 27 is a great place where you just get a chance to do that. But Acts chapter 27 is for me and for this series of lessons this is the first installment of them. It is, okay, God, I've got questions. I'm living in a world, you want to talk about storms? I've never used the word unprecedented in my life as many times as I've used the word over the last 4 or 5 years. So God, I want to know, can you handle the storms of life? Because it doesn't seem like there's anything around me that's doing very well at that. So people have been telling me, and I'm imagining someone on the outside of all this now, people have been telling me that I need to be a Christian, that I need to read the Bible, that I need to believe in God. So I don't know where else to turn. So here on my knees, I've got a question. Can you handle storms? And I think Acts chapter 27 is has a lot of interesting things that gets us started. And it certainly says, It certainly says, when all hope is lost, and the experts of the day weigh in, and they can't solve the problem. This ship's going down. We can't navigate it out of the storm. All hope is gone. When you get to that point, Acts chapter 27 says, God has not given up. God knows how to handle storms. Okay, now if that's all I got to say, I'm good with that. I hope I never forget that. And in addition to that, I hope God will help me find the right way to say that to people who are caught up in a storm these days and really don't know what's going on. Well, Nehemiah chapter 4 in your Old Testaments, Nehemiah chapter 4, I'd like for you to turn back there for just a minute and we'll just catch a glimpse of this passage. But it's another situation. I mean, God teaching through storms, that's a subject, that's a realm in which the Bible talks about that. There's a lot of storms talked about in the Bible. I mean, literal storms and otherwise. And one of those storms is right here in the book of Nehemiah and in chapter 4. That's where I'd like for you to look in your Bible. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse number 14. The children of Israel recently returned from captivity, go back to Jerusalem, and the walls have been broken down and neglected for 141 years. And people who had never built a wall in all their life are charged to build a wall. And to build a wall in the hottest time of the year, and while surrounded by enemy people who don't want them to succeed. And they're armed, and they know how to use them. And they don't like what they see in Jerusalem, and they're determined to stop it. And that's where we are in Nehemiah chapter 4. That's the storm. So here are these Jews huddled in this broken, incomplete city of Jerusalem, and they've heard 10 times that the enemy's coming. Y'all are going to be, there's no hope for you all, you Jews. You're going down. And so verse 14 says, when I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work. And then look at verse number 20. At whatever place you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Okay, so you could go, I think, to every storm that you can read about and think about in the Bible. And it's going to be resolved in the same way. The problems aren't going to be resolved by the experts of the day. They're not going to be resolved by the loudest voices in the room, people who have the most money, people who have the biggest weapons. They're not going to be able to solve the problem. The smartest people in the room aren't going to solve the problem. The solution is to, what did verse 14 say? Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and know about him that he will fight for you. That's what has to be, that's what we've got to remember. And so, when we have questions, and these last several years have challenged all of us, not just people outside. But when we've got questions, it is good and important and right to go back to Acts chapter 27 and to remember that in one way or another, these kinds of things have happened before. and you don't know how long it's going to last. You don't know how, it just seems like the clouds and the darkness and they've lasted forever. And it'll never return to normal. I'll never see the sun again. Okay. Whatever the answer to that is, just know that people have been there before. There have been storms before, and hopelessness and despair, and people have cried out, and they have said, all hope is lost. Okay? All right, so that's not the end of the story. The end of the story, God would say, listen to me. Remember who I am. Trust my words, trust my promises, and follow me. Mark chapter 4 is has become, especially in these last 4 or 5 years, has become one of my favorite passages of Scripture. And the simplicity of the story makes me a little bit ashamed that that it has not been elevated to its proper place of importance in my life before now. But anyway, it is now, and I'm so glad. In Mark chapter 4 and verse number 35, on that day when evening came, he said to them, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd, they took him along, and with him in the boat, just as he was, and the other boats were with him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Does that sound familiar? Verse 39, and he got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Hush, be still. And the wind died down and it became perfectly calm. And he said to them, Why are you afraid? How is it that you have no faith? How is it that you have no faith? And they became very much afraid and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Okay, so they had known Jesus to be the Messiah and the Son of God. And they had confessed that. They'd certainly seen the miracles and heard the teaching that would support that conclusion. But now, he has stepped up. Now, he is commanding the wind and the sea. And at his voice, all of it immediately calms down. And their response is, whoa, now we see Jesus even in a bigger, who is this that has that kind of power? Okay, but the part of this story that really is, I've recalled it, and I'm confident that I'll be in situations and I'm going to need to recall it all the more. Everything is going to be all right as long as we know that Jesus is on board. That's the bottom line. So the winds and the waves could be so strong and the water gushing over the side of your boat, and everything about your experience would tell you the end is near. What you need to know, what I need to know at familiar times like that, I know what that's like. I know what it feels like. I've tossed and turned in the middle of the night worrying about stuff. But the thing to remember, Jesus knows how to handle storms. He really does. He doesn't take them away. He doesn't take them away. In fact, he finds them quite useful because they test our faith. They test our faith. And they call upon us when everything about our human assessment, and maybe even the assessment of people around us, says there's no hope. It calls upon us to trust God. As long as he is on board, everything is going to be all right. Okay, so this lesson, this short time in Bible class, gives me the opportunity to set the stage for what's coming. because as you've already heard me say, it sure feels like for Kim and I, it was March 13th, 2020. March 13th, 2020. It's a Friday night. We were at a wedding in Savannah, Georgia. And Kim got eaten up by bugs. We went to a drugstore afterwards to get alcohol to rub on our bites, and there was no alcohol to be found. March 13th, 2020 marked the beginning of things getting all turned upside down. Never would I have imagined that elders in a local church would shut the doors for 2 weeks. But we did that in Newcastle, Indiana. Never before would I thought that in the parking lot of the church building, I would preach out of the back of a pickup truck to a short band radio system that could be tuned in by the members sitting in their cars around the parking lot. So that from my spot in the back of a pickup truck, all I could see were cars. I was preaching to cars. And things were happening and decisions had to be made so fast that it was not long before the word unprecedented really was, that's what we had. And there was one of the elders who was a good bit older than I am, and we turned to him and said, have you seen anything, is there any point of reference in your experience that can help navigate us through all this? And there was none. Nothing like this. We had never seen a storm like this. And then after some of that started to subside, it seemed that the forces of evil saw a crack in the armor, and the onslaught of other things, changes and attacks, and to an unsettled world and to an unsettled nation and to unsettled churches, then comes all kinds of chaos and confusion and upheaval that threatens some of the core principles of a country that we've grown up in and loved. And what in the world is going on here? What am I supposed to see here? Never have we seen a storm like this. Okay. Well, so with all of this, I just simply want to say, maybe our perspective is not clear enough, because you know what? There have been storms, and people have despaired for their lives, and it's happened actually a lot. And so we need to know that God does know how to handle storms. And if Jesus is on board, I don't know how this is going to end. I don't know the details. But if Jesus is on board, everything's going to be all right. One writer, A.C. Hervey, spoke about the alternations of life, the delays and the dangers and changes that can be a part of life, and he said these words: "Only let each alternation work its proper work, teaching patience and long-suffering, encouraging a life of simple faith, stimulating all the energies of the soul, stirring up to active exertion, engendering a calm and dauntless courage, and bringing out every resource of the mind according to the immediate need. And the storms and agitations of the voyage will in due time be exchanged for the peace and safety of an everlasting haven of glory in the presence of the Lord Jesus. Be prepared for all. Let nothing shake your faith or dim your hope. And then the most troubled voyage will have a blessed end. And in the last review of the roughest passage, your testimony will be, He hath done all things well. So I appreciate those words from a long time ago, but written by a man very familiar with the things experienced by our own day and time. The book of Acts itself declares the glory of the gospel and the success of a kingdom that can never be overthrown as its story goes through its persecutions and trials and ends up with a prisoner safely delivered to Rome. And from his prison cell in Rome, the gospel continues to be preached. As long as Jesus is on board, everything's going to be all right. The gospel and his kingdom will be successful. Thank you for letting me lay this foundation, and we'll be building on it as we go.